Welcome to the Austin Forum Upload, the podcast of the Austin Forum on Technology and Society. I'm your host, Jay Boisseau, also the executive director and founder of the Austin Forum. And today I'm here with our guest, Paco Nathan, who was our presenter at our recent event and was so popular, and we got so many comments on wanting to see the video afterwards, which had technical difficulties, that Paco, I had to get you on this podcast to appease all those people who wanted to hear the recording. So thanks for being with us again in podcast format.
Thank you so much, Jay. I really appreciate it.
Well, our topic today, of course, is going to be Paco's hot takes on the history, the current state, and the future of the AI sector and where AI was, is, and is going. But Paco, why don't we first give our listeners, why don't you give them some background on you so they understand why you really have a unique and important perspective on this?
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, I mean, about 40 years ago, I like to say I ignored the advice of my mentors, elders, whatever, and I decided to study AI in graduate school at Stanford. And while there, I got very much introduced to a topic that became near and dear to my heart called neural networks. That was about 1984. Also natural language and machine learning in general. And I got to work on some early neural network projects for just a brief section at Bell Labs, but then I actually went to Austin, and the thing that brought me there was Motorola. Motorola had a hardware accelerator project for neural networks starting in 1989. So we were pretty early. And that thing spun off. I became CTO. It was actually traded on NASDAQ. We had a little bit of a blip selling computer vision hardware, software out to like the big three in Detroit. But then nobody cared for a long time. So my story is that I cut over and did like network engineering, network security. I did real engineering for a while, and then suddenly people wanted to hear more about data. So I ended up leading data teams in the industry for about 10 years. And at this point, I lead a team called Darwin. We do open source integration for machine learning, mostly for enterprise apps. And we do a lot of work in Europe in manufacturing. So I get a real, first person perspective on what's happening in industry for AI adoption. But then I'm also working, my colleague Ben Lorca does the data exchange, and he's chair for like a half dozen different AI conferences. So I help out on a lot of conferences, also especially in the knowledge graph space, multiple conferences there. And so I get to meet a lot of the people who are leading companies in this space, sometimes under embargo before they can really, say the thing in public yet. So I get a real bird's eye view. And I do keep very hands-on in development, so very much involved in open source and seeing from that perspective, as well as advising like a half dozen different AI startups right now. I'm, sort of there to be a sounding board for the CEOs. So from these perspectives, hopefully I can bring up some hot takes on what's real and what's Memorex, so to speak. In terms of,
I'm afraid a lot of our listeners will not get that reference, but
I know.
That's an old marketing slogan, but yeah. So I appreciate that. You've been in the industry for a long time, and you've been working hands-on in it and working with experts and working with people actually using it, not just talking about it and pontificating about it and trying to sell it. And so that's what was so refreshing about your recent presentation at the Austin Forum, the presentation of which can be downloaded from the web event page about the event. So we've posted it there. But I really want to get into some of that here again for people to listen to in the audio format. And so, a lot of people think AI is new, which you and I know it's not. In fact, you've been working in it for a long time. But to be fair, a lot of people didn't realize they were using AI when they were getting recommendations for the movie to watch that night or the product to buy for Amazon, or maybe didn't even realize it when they were talking to their smart devices and things. But everybody became aware they were using it with Chat GPT and Stable Diffusion and such. But you have a different perspective on how we got to where we are. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your view of the industry in the 2000s and 2010s, predating ChatGPT, and how you think that evolved, and what you think people should know about how we got to where we are before we dive into where we are.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this thing kind of goes in waves, and so there'll be a blip. There'll be, and we can talk more about it, but there's usually some developments in algorithms, and then it's usually, I'm quoting from Luke Beowald out of Weights and Biases, but there's usually some multi-year latency between when an algorithm is published, which will later become groundbreaking. Nobody knows about it. Nobody cares. And then some years later, somebody pops up with the right data set to prove it out, and suddenly everybody cares. So you see this kind of latency of a few years, definitely. Like, for instance, with deep learning, that really broke in 2012 with AlexNet, but Hinton had published the algorithm 6 years earlier. And then it took 6 years for one of his graduate students to actually publish the thing that became popular because they had the ImageNet data set. So, we see this latency. And so we see basically the breakthroughs come in waves, and usually they get hyped up by, Gartner and all the rest, right? People who don't actually understand it and are like 3 levels removed from actually touching the technology, but they pontificate a lot. And so usually the near term, uh, the expectations near term are overinflated and completely divorced from any reality. But then the long term is usually much better than anybody can imagine. And I think that's definitely the case. What we saw, going from like 2012 into, say, adoption circa mid 2010s for deep learning in general. I think that there were all kinds of pronouncements, 12 years ago about how this was all going to shake out, and it got pretty strange. But then you start to see applications, and yeah, I mean, deep learning is pervasive, and you go and look at how many different consumer websites, the features that you know and love and use every day, are basically making use of deep learning, and that technology was not available, like I say, a decade ago. So I think we're seeing it in waves. I think the thing well, let me get back to the latency thing too, because I think it's super interesting. Like an algorithm would get published, but there's no proof for it yet until you get the data. Then some years later, the data set gets published. Suddenly people are really, really hyped about it, but it's still kind of researchy. And then it takes a while for the production applications in industry, right? And usually companies, they'll take their time to hire up the right people and get the right systems in place, test them, roll them out. And even then, usually a lot of the companies with really good AI teams, they don't want their people publishing, right? I mean, it's part of their secret sauce. But what we see lately is that eventually HR gets wise that the people that they're paying an obscene amount of money to every year to do, really specialized work in AI, they're getting antsy and they would like to be able to publish. So HR generally backs off after a while and says, "Oh, don't leave, don't jump ship. Yeah, you can publish your paper, no problem." So there's this other latency due to HR. And I mean, a case in point was Spotify. Like, Spotify was trying to monetize audiobooks, and they just couldn't make it work. Like, all of the technology for recommender systems didn't work for audiobooks because it's such a Pareto ratio. It's like, I'm blanking on the numbers right now, but a large fraction, a relatively small fraction of users represents most of the audiobook listening. So to be able to take and generalize that out to a broader population with a recommender system wasn't working. And eventually they actually earlier, I guess a couple months ago, they published a paper describing the AI approach that they used, which is a combination of knowledge graph and LLMs. But both of them were highly specialized. They do some really counterintuitive things. And they were able to turn something that was like razor thin margins into something that had like 40% business growth. I mean, it was really good. But it's interesting because that made use of something called a graph neural network, a GNN, and it's one of the first published industry use cases that I've seen. There have been some GNN work, but for like e-commerce and all, it just hadn't really proved out. And in fact, Neo4j, friends of mine there, they'd done an industry study. It's like, let's pinpoint where all the GNN use cases are in industry in 2023. And they came back with zilch. They're like, look, everybody we talked to said they dumped this stuff. It isn't working. And then a year later, Spotify says, oh yeah, well, we're doing it, but we weren't talking about it. So what I want to say is, like, you'll see a blip and then it'll take a while to shake out. And then real things happen probably after everybody almost forgot about it. And we're in the midst of that now. I think that there's really fantastic things that this class of large language models can do, mostly about recognizing syntax, sequence to sequence, or generating syntax, sequence to sequence. And a sequence can also be an image or a movie, right? Really fantastic things, but it's incredibly overblown by the hype, which is completely divorced from reality. And frankly, my take on that is when you look at the hyperscalers, when you look at the tech giants who are in this game, Alphabet, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, et cetera, you're gonna see what 6 or 8 companies there that are playing a very high stakes game. They're investing a lot in AI, making a lot of announcements. By the way, they happen to have $1 trillion valuations on the market. Microsoft's earnings estimates came out just earlier today, as well as Alphabet. That's making a lot of news that these companies are getting big payoffs because of AI, which is really great for their multi-trillion-dollar market cap. But on the same token, almost all of these companies are deep into online marketing. And they're definitely using that online marketing muscle to say, hey, we're the leaders in AI, therefore our market cap should be much higher. So a lot of the hype is very much tied to investor relations, is kind of like TLDR.
I've always worried about that. And, with the state of publicly held companies, you have to appease your investors. And so it's not sufficient to be a great company that's just as great tomorrow as you are today. You have to be more great tomorrow. And your greatness has to go up at a percentage greater than a savings account would have gone up. You can't just be flat great, right? People don't invest in you to stay great. They invest in you to be greater. And so it certainly is interesting what you just said about that, the hype machine there, needing to fuel that and fuel the hype about AI in order to be valued higher as an AI company and so on. Not unique to AI, but certainly one of the leading sources of buzz, perhaps the leading buzz topic in all of technology right now.
Well, especially from that, I mean, if you really want to get validation on this, roll back to like 2017 is when Google first published the paper called "Attention is All You Need," and it was really the first publication about what is now known as large language models, transformers. But a lot of different teams were working on this at the same time because it was research buzz, like everybody was chasing after this around 2017. Google published about it. And then what you see is like the hyperscalers start almost in like a 2 to 3 week cycle. They're publishing papers to outdo their competitors, things that they'd published like 3 weeks earlier. And all of these papers, when you go back and look at them, there's no way you can get confirmation because nobody else has their infrastructure. Like it's all enormous, extremely expensive infrastructure that only the other hyperscalers would have, but they're competing. And also their flavor of infrastructure is slightly different. So there's very little third-party validation about the wild claims that are being made. And yet the cycle of investing literally billions of dollars into this kind of marketing campaign, really, they're trying to one-up each other every 2 to 3 weeks. And they've been doing that since 2017. So the idea that there's accountability in this, from a scientific perspective, is really razor thin, and it's been proven out. A lot of claims get shot down, a few months later after people start teasing it apart. So I guess what I'd say is there's really amazing things to leverage here. There's also a lot of noise, and one statistic I want to throw down on people is when you look at machine learning right now. Do you want to take a guess at what the reproducibility rate is for research papers in machine learning?
I guess, well, I would have guessed before you asked me the question, I would have guessed 80 or 90%. But since you asked me the question, I'm now guessing it's much lower than that. Is it?
It is. And even for like peer-reviewed papers, really not all of them publish their paper or publish their code. And so reproducibility is kind of iffy. But amongst the ones that do, the fraction that do, the reproducibility rate is about 3%.
Oh my, wow. Okay, how are we defining reproducibility here? Because we know these things are producing, statistically, statistical probabilistic answers and whatnot, and the way that you do the operations, the exact data set you use, et cetera, the exact kind of network you constructed, the different layers in it can have some effects downstream. But I was hoping in broad terms, a model that could distinguish between cats and dogs in images
Sure.
would be
Sure.
highly reproducible at a very high rate.
Well, okay, so that kind of thing at say like a coarse grain kind of description, yes.
Okay.
But in terms of the machine learning research papers coming out saying, hey, we beat this benchmark, that's where you get this 97% drop off.
Is
And
this
the way I
academic
define,
or industry
yeah,
paper?
yeah.
Academic
Well,
papers, really? Okay.
it's hard to tell the difference between academic and industry papers. Most of the high-end machine learning research is sponsored by industry.
Yeah, true. That's right.
And so, yeah, I mean, the ability to take the paper and here's a GitHub repo associated with the paper. Let's go ahead and like install this, use this data, and try to reproduce the results that they published. Frankly, the drop-off rate is like 50%. You can't even install the software because it's usually like we had our postdoc and the postdoc got it running on a Windows box that nobody even knows where it is anymore. We're pretty sure it ran there once. I mean, there's that kind of crap going on. So
okay, that kind of reproducibility has been a problem in computational science and research for a long, long time. Being able to replicate the environment under which it was. So yeah, okay, now I understand how the numbers drop off.
But still, I mean, if we're talking about cases where a given model might cost $100 million to train, or even like some industry non-tech giant, but some industry player wants to go in and do their own model, and maybe that's 50 million. We're talking about pretty high stakes, and yet the kind of technologies that are coming into this, they're very interesting, super fascinating, great results that we're seeing. But when you try to look at the science and the accountability of science, it's pretty abysmal. So I think that's a kind of game, and I mean there are reasons for this. Machine learning dropped being peer reviewed quite as much compared to other fields for historical reasons because of NeurIPS, et cetera, a few years ago. And so now you just sort of get a flood of papers. But then you get journalists saying, oh my God, 200 papers were just published about this one thing. And then you go to try those 200 papers and you find out that only 6 of them work.
Wow. Okay, so we're seeing a time when people are publishing papers as fast as they can. They're not all peer reviewed. They're not all reviewed. And it's because everybody's getting on the AI hype train. And it's understandable. The amount of money in this is staggering. And I doubt that any of our listeners are unaware of people in their actual circles, their networks that are in the AI workspace and hearing about, oh, my friend is making this much money now as an AI engineer at this place, or their friend is, or something. So I think this AI hype train is certainly running through most circles, maybe running over some companies, but there's certainly lots of good in it, right? So I along with your hot takes that point out that there's a lot of fluff and a lot of hype, who do you think is telling the story well these days? Who do you trust and who do you not trust? Who should our listeners trust and who should they not trust when hearing about advances in AI?
I mean, there are a lot of good sources. I mean, I in the talk, I was pointing out some use cases that I really like. One of my favorite is coming out of Allen Institute, which is kind of associated with Microsoft, but not exactly. There's a number of projects there that they call AI for Good. One of them is called Skylight, and what they do is they take a lot of different signals, different types of satellite telemetry, different vessel tracking, data from buoys, drones, etc. But they're tracking vessels at sea to try to understand, is this smuggling? Is this illegal fishing? And this is a very complex ensemble of models. There's some great talks by Patrick Boikema about this. But Skylight gets used by many governments around the world to track whether or not they dispatch Coast Guard to intercept some vessels. So it's a pretty high stakes game, a lot of data, really super interesting because they end up having to have different deep learning models literally for like every different kind of satellite, every different kind of signal going in. That's one case where I think we're seeing, hey, here's a really great example of using this kind of technology. Other things, I really like the work coming out of Caltech from Anima and Nankumar Her team has been doing like weather and climate forecast models that are, like 5 orders of magnitude better in terms of accuracy and performance, faster definitely than the prior generation of weather models. And when you look at like wildfires and droughts and hurricanes and all the rest, those models become kind of important. So that's another area we're seeing this technology, the current generation machine learning, what people are calling AI. It's really had some breakthroughs in certain areas, and certainly in the sense of like, if you have a fairly constrained language, you can recognize it with a model, and then you can generate it with a model. I think that works really well. And if you work in an area where there is a constrained language, like for instance, contract law is a very constrained language. It's very precise. We know what each word means when they're paired with other words in a contract. And I've seen like a company that I really like is called TextMine, where they're using knowledge graphs and LLMs. You can ingest like all the contracts that your company has, and then look for different common terms between vendors and do that kind of management. Another area is, definitely a lot in like healthcare, life sciences. There's fairly constrained language that's being used to describe things. And so I think that manipulating language and images in areas where it's well known, narrowly defined, we're seeing a lot of traction, and that's great.
So, of course, our listeners are probably mostly not reading the papers on Archive or other places. They're probably mostly getting information, as we all do, from media, and that often includes analysts and their reports that we might get in through the media. So, you had some hot takes to share on that, and I wanted you to share your thoughts on how the media can even cover well something as complex as AI, and how the analysts can cover it, because we tend to go to them for projections on things, but projections on straightforward things to understand are very different than projections on technology evolution on complex technology. So why don't you share with our listeners your hot takes on how to read the media, and how to analyze the analysts when they're talking about AI?
Yeah, no, that's been a dumpster fire. I mean, I was picking on Gartner. There's this kind of business executive, and I know these people, right? Or at least some of them. Some of them are my customers. But there's a kind of business executive who's like, Gartner will say XYZ, and 2 months later they have XYZ implemented in their corporation. And there's just, there's this sense that like analysts will get out there and say all kinds of crazy things, but once there starts to be consensus among analysts on a new technology area, then everybody just sort of accepts it and drives forward. After a while, though, reports from the actual practitioners start to percolate up, and those are usually counterfactuals, and those are usually not quite what the pundits had predicted. And so there's a reckoning that comes afterwards, and there are some entities that might crash and burn, but everybody figures out how the technology really shakes out, and they move on. I think right now we're at that point where Gartner and others have just overhyped a lot of weird, strange, distorted perspectives on what's happening with machine learning, and they're not really surfacing the stuff that is interesting and is really moving the needle. But they're surfacing a lot of stuff that is just, it's marketing. And so we're seeing now where the practitioners' counterfactuals are bubbling up. And I think that if a person really wants to get a good read on this, I highly recommend Hugging Face. There's some great services on Hugging Face where, it's a little bit like Reddit in the sense of like, if you could get thousands of machine learning experts to sort of go in and figure out what are their takes on the latest papers, and then use that as like a daily feed. Hugging Face has that. And so it's a really great place.
I've never heard Hugging Face called the Reddit of AI, but okay, that's an interesting take. Okay,
it's sort of, if you took Reddit and GitHub and slammed them together just for AI, that would be Hugging Face. And they're great people, Clem and company. They're really wonderful people. I think my take on their mission is they're looking at where the open source model community, which is a large ecosystem, where all those startups are finding some friction, and how can they use their capitalization and their power to come in and like remove the friction points, make services that help the whole ecosystem move forward. So I think that, get involved on places like Hugging Face is a really good resource. A lot of great projects there to sample. A lot of people to follow. Another one I really like is MLOps community. And I like it because it's just so lively and huge. But Demetrios Brinkman has done a really good job of bringing together not just MLOps people, but also the data engineers, the ML engineers, the product managers, all the people who'd love to learn about the above. Get them all together, get thousands of them together, and put 80 people up on stage and have them give their perspectives of what they're seeing on the ground. That's another one that I highly recommend.
Great. So what about conferences? Do you think the conferences are good for people to attend? Are they more objective, or are people getting so caught up in the hype when they get the keynote at a conference that if they're not maybe being as objective and realistic about the limitations as well as the benefits?
It's a mixed bag. I got to tell you, coming into early 2023, I was almost ready to say, I don't want to be on any, I'm involved with a lot of conferences, but in early 2023, I was ready to say, look, I'm just going to back off for a while until, you figure out what you're going to put on stage, because there are some things that I don't want to be in the same camera frame with. But it worked out better. I think that there was a lot of hype in the end of 2022 and early 2023. But the conferences I've been involved with, I'm really grateful that the conference organizers have been very selective, and they're really trying to get the right message and vet things. And it's not just marketeering. So yeah, I would say that in general, terms like AGI, I find it to be it's very slippery. It's like, we can't give you a good definition of what AI is, so let's make up another definition. AGI. Oh no, let's do hard AGI. It's like the slipperier the term gets, the more that like new acronyms are created. So I think AGI sort of means whatever the speaker wants it to mean, but definitely there are some people with not the best track records who are using it to their own ends. So I avoid kind of that ilk. I'm interested in what industry can use. I'm interested in open source. I want to see results now. I want to get my hands on it and make sure it's real. And I am involved in some conferences. I'll be emceeing. Ben Lorca is chair for the AI conference, and that'll be in San Francisco again this year in September. It was a huge hit last year, sold out hard. I'll be emceeing that, and I'm really looking forward to the folks who'll be joining us. I'm just flying out now. I'm going out soon to the KnowledgeCraft conference in New York City, which is it's on Roosevelt Island at Cornell Tech. It'll be May 6th through 10th. I'm going to do some track hosting and teach a masterclass there. And I mean, I can go through the list. There's AI. The AI Quality Conference will be in June in San Francisco, part of the ML Labs community. And AI quality, I think, is a really good theme right now. I can give you a laundry list of these, but I had gone into 2024 thinking maybe I'll just back off of conferences a little bit, and instead I'm probably involved in twice as many as I'd hoped to be.
Well, one of the things I'll probably do offline is pick your brain about how to establish an annual one here in Austin as we create
awesome.
Austin AI Alliance. I have so many good friends and colleagues here in AI, but we don't have our own AI conference. And I felt like we're a great city for it. We're an emerging city for AI leadership. I mean, Silicon Valley, stands head and shoulders above most places in the world and most tech things, but there's AI is emerging in lots of great cities around the world. And I feel like Austin is well positioned to be one of those. So I'll probably pick your brain about how to have a non-hypey AI conference, how to have a good, effective AI conference someday, because things are moving so fast. And one of the reasons we do the Austin Forum and the Austin Forum Upload podcasts and such is that time passes linearly, but knowledge grows exponentially. So how do you keep up? You've got to find ways to have lifelong learning and exchanging of information, and have people who can accelerate your understanding faster than real time, and in some sense they can help you jump up that learning curve. And I find education, great classes and great conferences can be great ways to do this. So I'm glad you're back in the conference game after sitting out.
I think Austin is very uniquely poised. Also, it's a great destination city. It's a wonderful city to come and have a conference at. People from other places, also just kind of where it's located. I think there's a lot of interesting tech in this space that's coming out of pockets like, say, in Denver or in Missouri. I mean, National Geospatial has a big thing in Missouri, so there's a lot of
Mhm.
interesting startups kind of collecting around that. A lot up out of Chicago area. I could just go down the list, but I think that Austin would be a nice center for a lot of stuff that won't be quite driven to the extremes of San Francisco or New York City.
Great. All right. Let me ask you a question about the hype around LLMs and generative AI overall. We're seeing, of course,
Yeah.
everybody shift, the solutions providers and the services companies shifting lots of their effort around generative AI. And I'm teaching a class in generative AI next week. I like generative AI. I recognize its strengths. I recognize its weaknesses, but I'm seeing a lot of things talked about lately in the media, and then it can do this for your business and that seem to be ignoring the fact that it's got fundamental issues. I did see a great
Yeah.
comment from Jan LeCun about 2 weeks ago about, he almost said generative AI sucks. We need to figure out what's beyond that. And then
Yeah.
Meta promptly released Llama 3, which
Right.
he proudly proclaimed. So I didn't know what to quite make of those two statements in back-to-back weeks. But how do you give me your hot take on the state of generative AI now? And do you think it's really going to be entrenched in enterprise on a day-to-day basis over the coming 2-3 years? Or do you think that it's got a ceiling and that people are going to realize, okay, it's good for certain things, just like PowerPoint is good for a presentation, but it's not the case that we need to buy a generative AI license for every one of our workers to do everything they do? Where do you
Yeah.
fall on this?
Yeah, I would tend to buy. Andrew Ng has a great talk that he did at Stanford Biz School, and it was about an outlook, like a 3-year outlook, and he puts up the bubbles for here's where we are with generative AI, here's where we are with reinforcement learning, here's where we are with supervised learning, et cetera, et cetera, and then 3 years out, this is how much each of these bubbles has grown or shrunk. And he's saying, yeah, okay, we'll see some growth in production use of generative AI, not nearly anywhere close to what's being projected. We'll probably see a much larger uh, growth in supervised learning, and I think a lot of that is because there's so much incredible amounts of capital and intense focus being dumped into hardware development right now, and we're going to see windfalls from that. That's how hardware works. And so with the AI chips, all the efforts that are going into AI chips now, we're going to see other things that can be done much faster at a much better price point, which, it's not going to be a chatbot. It's not going to be an LLM. It might be something a little bit more mundane, but it solves a business case and it does it a lot faster and cheaper than what we could do before. So I really think that the growth will probably be more in like supervised learning. And I'll bring up that ILO from Andrew Ng. It's interesting because when you look at the history, we were talking about my grad advisor was Doug Lennett, who was in Austin for much of his life. He lived there doing psych. Unfortunately, just passed last year. But frankly, Doug's postdoc was something called his PhD dissertation was something called artificial mathematics, and then his postdoc built on that, and it was something called Eurisco, and it was a generative AI platform in the late 70s.
Wow.
And Eurisco did some crazy things. One is like Doug used to compete in science fiction conventions, the kind of thing where you build a fleet and these space fleets go into battle. And he went to one of them using his AI approach in the late 70s and early 80s. I'll dig up the notes. But basically, he wiped them out. He built, he generated a fleet that was all basically suicide ships with one little command ship way, way, way in the back. And he just had everybody wipe out. He wiped out everybody while they wiped out his fleet, except for the one that held back position. And then he wiped up. And so the Traveler competition changed the rules. They're like, we're not going to let this happen. Next year, Doug fed the rules in, generated a new fleet, wiped out the competition. So Traveler changed the rules and said, next year, no more Doug Lennett. This is basically, there were generative AI approaches that were very interesting back then. People weren't giving them time of day. We didn't really have the hardware. We didn't have the data. If you want a more current case, definitely there was a company that is a company called Primer AI. I was advising during the pandemic. Primer had been working on behalf of large scale customers like DoD and Walmart and others. They've been working on generative approaches for summarization. So, I mean, one of their use cases that stands out was like Walmart's legal team. The inbound email for Walmart's legal team is like off the charts. So they need to run some pretty large industrial strength summarizers just to make sense of their inbound court, legal cases. And similarly, DoD has the same thing when it comes to anti-terrorism and all that. They're scanning all kinds of stuff. So Primer had been working on this, and they've been working on generative AI approaches and really making some headway, circa 2019. And when the pandemic hit, one of the things they did was a COVID primer. So they took all of the COVID-related research, including the not so good, fake stuff that was being propagated, and they would summarize that nightly so that frontline healthcare providers could have a place to go and figure out not only what the news was that they needed to know, but also what the bad stuff was they were going to get hit with from patients. And I mean, the frontline healthcare workers during the pandemic, of course, didn't have time to be scanning research. But here is a way of taking essentially LLMs and transducing all of the flood of research that was pouring out into something that would make sense. And it was for a very critical mission, very timely mission. So, I mean, you can go back, I think it's still up, the COVID primer. That was a real example to me. And I mean, that was in 2020. And I think that we'll see a lot of other places where, there's a business case, people are just flooded with information. How can we make sense of it? This is a really great way to do that. And again, if you have a specialized task that your organization understands really well because you do it all day, every day, then that's a great candidate for something to augment with this kind of technology because you understand how to evaluate it. So I think that we'll see things roll out. It'll probably trickle out slower than the projections. But I think long term, as we learn to do more hybrid approaches between, say, the symbolic AI side and the statistical AI side, that's another one we should cover. There's a great talk that Connected Data World published, a guy named Frank van Harmelen, and I can give you the link for it. It's in my notes we circulated. But van Harmelen is showing, there's these two camps in AI, and they don't talk with each other. Seriously, they don't. I try to keep a foot in both, and they really don't like each other. One is more about, let's just take all the data and build up machine learning models, and it'll be glorious. The other is, let's take our time and build up things and make symbolic inference a little bit more along the lines of what Syke and Doug Lennon were doing. And there's a pendulum of about every 10 years that like one side gets the upper hand. And right now we're heavy over on the statistical side. Mm-hmm. But what we're seeing is that the real production use cases tend to be more hybrid. So case in point, you use an LLM for your business case, you find out it hallucinates. Oh no, what do we do? You go and you start using something like GraphRag, and now you're bolting on a knowledge graph that is grounded in the actual facts and relationships about your business case. And so now the LLM will say things that are like grounded in reality. And that's a way of blending sort of the symbolic knowledge graph with the statistical LLM for a hybrid solution. And there's more sophisticated ways to have hybrids. But I think this is part of the path going forward. And van Harmelen really breaks it down. Van Harmelen does a really good job of showing that even some of the great success stories coming out of Alphabet and others, how should we say, the polite term would be they were carefully crafted. In research, we also call that cherry picking. But basically, you look at where the success stories were, and it's like, wow, that aligned with just the perfect kind of data that was available. But if you shifted the use case slightly over here, the data wouldn't be available, you wouldn't get good results. So that was very carefully crafted. And I think that's part of the marketing that's going on right now. It's touted as being something very general purpose, but I guess it's only general purpose if you're Alphabet and you have billions to spend on marketing.
There are so many more questions that I could ask you. And so I guess the first one I must say, can we do a part 2 of this podcast? Because we're running out of time, but I want to end it with our traditional recommendations for our listeners. but I want to get to the future and what some of the other methods of AI are. What is the future of deep neural networks and large language models and things that are using megawatts of power and whatnot? What are some of the, so I'd love to get to all that, but since we're close to the end of time, I'm going to beg you for a part 2 to this. I think our listeners would love it. And I'm going to close part 1 with this. What is your top recommendation for our listeners, both personally and professionally, at this point in AI? What should they do to understand it, and what should they make sure their company is doing to utilize it?
Well, my favorite there is really get some hands-on. Obviously, there's a lot of chatbots. It's not hard to get hands-on with those, but I would dig a little bit deeper. I think even just deploying an LLM for some kind of use case, there are a lot of open source approaches like Replicate. There's a lot of endpoints like Anyscale or Unify. There's a lot of ways that you can really get your hands dirty with the technology for some simple kind of use case that's meaningful for you, and then you can make your own evaluations. And it's a lot like what we saw when we rolled out cloud. I was one of the guinea pigs for AWS back in the day, and when we rolled out cloud, the way that we turned the tide was, a software engineering manager could spend $50 over the weekend and prove out a case in the cloud, walk in Monday, and that manager's competing manager from another department was, telling the execs that they needed 6 months and this many thousands of dollars. And somebody else is just like, no, I spent $50. I proved it. Here you go. That's how we turn the tide on cloud.
No, that's a well-known anecdote that I'm glad that you have confirmed is a real way that actually happened.
No, it's actually, that was happening, and I had that conversation with Andy Jassy back in the day, back when he was leading AWS. Because he was just brainstorming. It's like, how do we get the message out there? And that anecdote was actually something we were seeing in practice. Yeah, I think the same thing here. You can spend $10 by pulling down something on Replicate, and wiring it up in some applications, really getting some idea of what's involved and maybe where some of the directions, potentials, and limitations are. This is something that, when you look, for instance, there are great use cases that are low power on low cost hardware. Frankly, because at the end of the day, this kind of inference is usually limited by connectivity, by I/O. It's not limited by compute. That's kind of a misnomer. So get your hands dirty, and you'll make better decisions, basically.
Paco, thank you so much for joining us. I really am going to nag you an email after this podcast about trying to schedule a part 2, because I really do want to go beyond some of these topics, but we want to give our listeners these sort of commute length podcasts, if you will. As Austin's gotten big, it means our podcast has gotten longer, but I want to make sure that I give them something for the trip home from the office now as well. So we'll try to schedule that with you. And thank you again so much for your presentation earlier this month. Thank you for this podcast today, and thank you in advance, I hope, for a part 2 where we look at what is the future of some of these methods and what are some of the promising alternatives to these kinds of methods. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Jay. I look forward.
Thanks for listening to the Austin Forum Upload. You can listen to additional episodes and check out a schedule of our monthly in-person events at austinforum.org. The Upload is a production of the Austin Forum on Technology and Society, a nonprofit organization here in Austin, Texas.